in your extensive experience, you mentioned trenbolone a little while ago. I know before you used to be really concerned about using trenbolone, and probably rightfully so. I don't know how much you did use it, but I was curious, out of the androgens that you use, which have been your favorite, and for maybe briefly, for which reasons? Not in terms of cognition, just in terms of physical results.
Yeah, so D-bol, it's funny because D-bol is thought of like a beginner steroid, the first one that everybody does, but it's still one of my favorites, and it's still one of the favorites of a lot of high-end bodybuilders. They still use D-bol like they do in the beginning, and the dosage doesn't even change that much. It's pretty awesome, and it's super cheap. And yeah, like you mentioned in Thailand, like I've got the bottle of D-bol. It's so cheap, it's practically free. It's like buying vitamin C.
The pink ties.
Yeah, well, Blue Hearts is what seems to be widely available here. They're because they're little blue. They're tiny little blue heart, and they come in bottles of like 500 for like $20 if you go to the right place. It's a lifetime supply. And then as far as because PEDs includes a lot more than just steroids, but I'll just stay on sort of the androgen receptor.
Yeah. I'll ask you more about the other stuff.
Yeah. So like RAD140 is a SARM, but the performance increase I get from RAD140 is almost greater than anything other than methyltranolone, like methyltren. I mean, methyltren's an amazing performance-enhancing drug, but it doesn't really build muscle. It just gives you that aggression and neurological connection to the muscle to be able to lift harder and heavier for a very short period of time, but it's very highly toxic. So I like RAD140 because I've experienced no side effects from it, but it gets me that same type of mind-muscle connection and ability to contract the muscle harder. I like test suspension and I like trend suspension. Because they're fast acting, they're in and out, they hit hard. There's something very different about test suspension than actual testosterone. I don't know exactly why it's so much more powerful. Coach Trevor used to tell me this big 20-minute science explanation, but the bottom line is testosterone suspension is not just like testosterone. It's something more special.
Can I ask you briefly about, so you said some interesting things. One thing I wanted to, but before we get on that, you mentioned the methyltren affecting the neurological connection you have to your muscles, having an immediate performance increase. The interesting thing is, on your interview with Mark Bell was saying steroids don't really make you stronger, which I found really bizarre to say, because there is an immediate response when you take testosterone suspension. Or if you take, I have never tried trend suspension myself, but if you take halotestin or trenbolone, there is an immediate result that's a strength increase, but it doesn't necessarily build up. So it doesn't mean that just because I got 10% stronger today, I'm going to get 40% stronger if I stay on it for a week. You might just keep that baseline strength stronger over a while, but it does have an immediate effect. That's certainly true, and that's through the adrenaline and norepinephrine. There's some certain changes in the neurological system. So that's certainly true. I also, like you, when I used to be lifting, I used to be very fond of test suspension. I loved it for a variety of reasons, including for mood enhancement, but especially as a pre-workout. In my opinion, the greatest pre-workout, that if you take a little bit of Anadrol, I was an arm wrestler. If you take a little bit of an Anadrol and 100 milligrams of test suspension, you have a great time in the gym. You don't want to leave. You feel like a monster, and it's a great feeling. Now, about RAD140, I don't know as much about the SARMs. I'm curious, do you know specifically how it is selective at its agonism at the androgen receptor? Like, does it not agonize particular receptors in the body? Do we know, or we just think it's a partial agonist? Because there's a difference between a selective modulator and a partial agonist. Partial agonist meaning that it just has less affinity. So, for example, the methyltren will have more of an affinity at the receptor, which is also why it's more toxic, by the way. Because actually, we could talk about that later. But so, do you know much about how it affects things differently? We hope it won't affect the prostate as much, but do we know exactly why? Have there been studies on prostate tissue?
I think you'll find studies that SARMs actually reduce prostate size. So they act almost like a SERM when it comes, like a selective estrogen receptor modulator. So I do believe they are binding to the prostate, but they're not having an androgenic effect. So, whether they're, the question is whether it's tissue selective, like whether it's binding only to muscle or whether it's binding everywhere. It's just having more of an anabolic instead of an androgenic effect. I think it's a little bit of both. I think when I first started talking about SARMs, I said it was more selective towards muscle tissue, as in it's going to bind to muscle and it's not going to bind to prostate. But I think because of the studies we've seen on actually lowering prostate size and sometimes even growing hair on the head, that means it's probably binding to the receptor so that DHT is not binding to the receptor, but that it's not having the same effect that DHT would have if it were bound to the receptor. So it's probably a little bit of both, but I can't say for certain.
Yeah, sometimes the modulators, I'm not as familiar with androgen receptors. Most of what I study are in the brain, but sometimes the modulators will affect basically how the agonist can bind. And it's a little complicated for every different receptor in the body. So it's really interesting to learn more about that. By the way, a brief note for yourself, because you're mentioning prostate size. I've recently discovered that, I don't know if you know this, it's not just that androgens increase prostate size. There's also, in people who are treatment resistant to androgen blocking therapies like finasteride or Proscar, they find that prolactin often increases the prostate size. So hyperprolactinemia will cause benign prostate hyperplasia. So it's really important to control prolactin. The problem is, of course, cabergoline is tied to a really horrible, cabergoline is no longer prescribed in the US for Parkinson's. And the reason why is because fibrotic development around the heart valves happens at high doses. Now, Parkinson's, they take higher doses than people do for hyperprolactinemia, but nonetheless, you must think that with the mTOR, the IGF-1, all of these different things that are going on in our bodies as bodybuilders, I'm not a bodybuilder, but for bodybuilders, what the fibrotic development around the valves of the heart with cabergoline would be really dangerous. Now, on the other hand, pramipexole does not have this effect. It's a different kind of agonist of the, or of blocker of the dopamine receptors. So is it an agonist? I don't know. Either one. It's a different kind. It falls into a different class. And pramipexole has caused heart failure, but reversible heart failure, and there's only a couple of cases, whereas the cabergoline, very concerning, just so you know.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful information. Something I'm struggling with right now is that my prolactin levels are almost zero. And there's an endocrinologist, a doctor that specializes in male hormones here in Thailand. And it's one of the many reasons I like being here in Thailand is I can network with people like this from all over the world. And he's saying that some side effects I have of maybe lower sex drive or various other things may be caused by actually having too low of prolactin. He wants to see my prolactin level come up. In order to do that, he wants to see my estrogen level come up to help bring the prolactin up. And so that's something that we're working through, which is too bad because I actually love taking cabergoline. I feel really good on it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I feel really good mentally on it. So it's unfortunate to hear about the potential heart issue. I have to research that more for sure.
Well, you'll certainly feel better mentally because I was incorrect earlier. It's a dopamine agonist. See, Parkinson's syndrome happens when people lose dopaminergic neurons. And what they do basically is they give them L-Dopa and various things to try to increase the dopamine in the brain to control their body movements. And cabergoline does that as well. So obviously you'll feel better on it. Question, is your estrogen low as well? Is that it? Because I keep my estrogen within. What's the ratio of testosterone to estrogen that you keep?
Oh, well, it's all over the place. I mean, like at any given time, it would be for whatever I'm trying to do with my hormone level at that time, I can manipulate it. So like right now, for example, I'd say my estrogen is probably right in the middle of normal range. That's where I'm trying to keep it right now.
Doctors tend to go by a ratio. The 10-to-1 ratio is the classic practice for maintaining mental health and stuff like that. If you keep your estrogen at a normal range for a normal person, but your testosterone is over 1,000, you will have some side effects. And keep in mind another thing, all right, Tony, not to give you advice, I love talking about this stuff. The other thing is that the estrogen, it's cardioprotective for sure. It is cardioprotective, preventative for atherosclerosis. It is neuroprotective. So there are studies I mentioned on my channel before. If you give androgens to an animal without an estrogen blocker, they will not experience neurological loss until you go to high doses. Medium dose, they'll be fine. But if you give them an aromatase inhibitor, they will get neurotoxic effects even at low doses of androgens. So they start losing brain cells, which don't come back except for in two parts of the brain, the hippocampus and so on. So estrogen is so protect. And the other thing is progesterone. In the bodybuilding, we have a bad idea of progesterone, but progesterone is actually really stimulating for sexual activity in men. In fact, progesterone creams are used to help people deal with erectile dysfunction.
Yeah, so I actually buy over-the-counter progesterone and estrogen so that I can experiment with those also. I actually just came across my progesterone.
Oh, fantastic.
This is over the counter in Thailand. Yeah, because my progesterone levels, I believe, are low as well. And that's when I started experimenting. Like they say that Anadrol is a really funny drug. They actually don't understand completely how it works. But they think that it acts on the progesterone receptors also. And there's certain parts of me that feel really good on Anadrol. And so I thought, okay, let's isolate whether it's the progesterone effects from it. So let's take progesterone and see. So that's one of the experiments. But one of my limiting factors is gyno. And it's not bad. You can never see it. You'd never be able to see it.
Removed?
No, I haven't, and I need to.
Because the recommendation, there's a guy in California. He's, in my opinion, the best. He's in Orange County, Dr. Cruz. The best. Better than the guy in New York, in my opinion.
I'll write that down. And I'm in Thailand, too. It should be easy to find cheap here, but I just haven't looked into it yet.
Yeah,
so
you don't want one higher than the other.
Yeah. I'm willing to pay extra to make sure it's really good. My limiting factor with my estrogen is that I don't want to exacerbate the gyno. And most people, if they approach steroids intelligently from the beginning, they're never going to have a gyno problem unless they had a youth gyno problem, not caused from steroids, because that's very common in puberty in America these days. But I did experiments to see what my threshold for getting gyno was, like intentionally to see what I could take to get gyno. What I didn't realize is when it came on so fast and so aggressive and then takes so long to get rid of, I thought I'd be able to mitigate it much faster. So that was the mistake. I don't regret it, but now I have to, my experimentation is a little bit limited by it, because although I want my estrogen up for health benefits, I don't want to exacerbate the gyno.
Yeah, and this is why I feel like anyone who wants to really use PEDs long-term and be very muscular needs to get the gland removal, because the estrogen is so protective against all the harms that we're concerned about.